is showing, so you're good to go.
Okay, excellent. So I will probably present for about 15 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. Happy to answer questions as we go along or at the end. So hi, everybody. I'm Juliet Homer with Pacific Northwest National Lab. And as Chair French said, I'm going to discuss the FERC Order 1920 and specifically the state agreement process. Okay, so I'm going to provide a one-slide overview of FERC Order 1920 and then talk about cost allocation and the state agreement process. Then I'm going to propose potential elements of a template that could be used for a state agreement process, and then touch on a few additional considerations. So in terms of who must make compliance filings in FERC Order 1920, I've been talking with folks from the non-RTO and ISO regions recently, and I realize that there's a little bit of confusion in those regions exactly kind of who has the compliance requirement and what are the planning responsibilities. So I thought I'd just briefly touch on this, maybe review for many of you. And I do want to caveat this by saying too, I'm not an attorney, but I'm an engineer, but I've been working a lot on FERC Order 1920 over the last almost year. We've been doing a lot of technical assistance with states, and I've been kind of really deep into it, but I'm not an attorney. But generally, the way I understand it is the filing responsibilities for FERC Order 1920, the compliance filings, are required from all FERC jurisdictional transmission providers. So in the RTO and ISO regions, the RTO and the ISO is the one that'll make the filing on behalf of its members. In non-RTO and ISO planning regions, like Northern Grid, West Connect, and in the Southeast, each transmission provider will file individually, but they'll be coordinated through their FERC Order 1000 planning region. And that's the map I have here is the FERC Order 1000 planning regions. In terms of who's responsible to do the planning in FERC Order 1920, the planning must be conducted regionally at the level of the transmission planning region. And the specific responsibility attaches to the transmission providers. Again, either the RTO or ISO in those regions. And in the non-RTO and ISO regions, each utility that has the open access transmission tariff is responsible for the planning. So that just kind of maybe helps to orient folks in the non-RTO and ISO regions. So here's my quick summary slide of FERC Order 1920. The title is Building for the Future Through Electric Regional Transmission Planning and Cost Allocation. Now, this order was originally issued in May of 2024, updated in November 2024, and then again in April of 2025. So we've got FERC Order 1920, the 1920A, and 1920B was the most recent update. And FERC Order 1920 requires comprehensive long-term regional planning with a 20-year planning horizon and a minimum of a 5-year refresh for the planning. 7 categories of factors must be used to forecast the long-term transmission planning landscape. At least 3 plausible and diverse scenarios need to be looked at with at least 1 stress test extreme weather sensitivity for each scenario. Now, here's the part that gets a little bit interesting. Is there a question?
Philip noise adaptation of the Tom Clan.
Oh, okay. Great. So
I got them muted.
Great. Thank you. So another thing in FERC Order 1920 is that the 7 benefit metrics. You probably heard about those. And those 7 benefits must be quantified and applied when evaluating and selecting projects. So I think that's kind of a core part of 1920, that as these projects are considered, these 7 specific benefits need to be considered. And then planners must consider grid enhancing technologies and upsizing. So another thing that's, I think, very important with Order 1920, it requires selection criteria for the potential inclusion of projects, but it does not mandate that selection of any projects. So it does require this process and selection criteria, but does not mandate the selection of projects. In addition to the regional aspects of 1920, there's the interregional. It requires improved interregional coordination and enhanced transparency, even for local transmission planning inputs. Okay, so now we move to cost allocation. So I like to think about it 2 pieces really for the cost allocation in FERC Order 1920. There's a must aspect and then there's a may aspect. So the first sub-bullet here is that the must. And so transmission providers must file a default or ex ante cost allocation method to use for projects selected through FERC Order 1920. So the transmission providers file this ex ante cost allocation method. And the states can inform and provide alternatives to that ex ante method. They can, the state entities must say whether they agree with the ex ante filed by the transmission providers. And the states can propose their own ex ante methods, and the transmission providers must file those methods. But in order to be considered, the transmission providers must agree to those, to the ex ante methods filed by states. So now we move on to the May part of cost allocation in 1920, and this relates to the state agreement process, which we're going to dig into a little bit more here. So the transmission providers may file a state agreement process, which is a process that would be used later and lead to a state agreed upon cost allocation method that would be used in lieu of the ex ante method. So states are the ones that design the state agreement process, and then the transmission providers must file that process at FERC, regardless of whether the transmission providers support the proposal. So the state agreement process cannot be the sole method for cost allocation. And the timelines around that state agreement process is that the process must be designed so that it can run before, but it must go no later than 6 months after projects are selected for regional cost allocation. So that's the timing piece of it. And here's the kicker, if the state agreement process doesn't result in an agreed upon cost allocation method, the project defaults to the ex ante cost allocation method. So I chatted with a few what I would consider national experts on FERC Order 1920 as I was preparing for this presentation today. And honestly, people kind of have different opinions about the state agreement process. One person I was speaking with said that they think this provides a lot of power to the states to design this process and then use it to develop cost allocation. And so they're very optimistic about it and thought it was a really important opportunity for states. Someone else I spoke with said that they feel like it would be really difficult in practice to use the state agreement process to come up with a cost allocation method. And they hope that the ex ante method would really be designed really well, and that would probably be what's used most often, and that moving into the state agreement process, there would be kind of difficult maybe to apply. And the fact that if its agreement isn't reached, you kind of go back to the ex ante method. This other person I spoke with wasn't as optimistic or bullish on the state agreement process. But everyone agrees that the states should file one in their FERC Order 1920 compliance filing periods. But whether and how it might be used, maybe some differences of opinion on that. Okay, so another thing here, so relevant state entities, many of you may know this already, but I thought I'd review. So relevant state entities are identified in 1920 as the group that can participate in the state agreement process. And that is defined as any state entity responsible for electric utility regulation or siting electric transmission. Or any other designated entity by law. And in terms of how this is filed, the Order 1920 requires transmission providers to add new sections to their existing open access transmission tariff that every FERC jurisdictional transmission provider is required to have. So if it's filed, the state agreement process would become a new component within the transmission provider's OAT. So just a little detail there. But what does FERC Order 1920 say now about the state agreement process itself? If the relevant state entities adopt the process, the following information must be included in the proposed tariff. And I adapted this list from one that Lauren Azar had developed previously, so you may have seen some of these. But just to review, what must be included as the states file this process is they must identify the event that would trigger the beginning of the state agreement process, the duration of the process, recognizing it can't exceed 6 months after facilities are selected. Must identify which entities can participate in the process. Is it just the relevant state entities or others? How the state agreement process will result in the cost allocation. What constitute agreement? Is it consensus? Is it 2/3 majority? What is the voting? What would constitute agreement? That needs to be filed in the state agreement process. And then how the agreement would be communicated to the transmission providers, and then what information states will need to or receive, and what conditions must be met before the transmission providers files the state agreement process at FERC, and then identify the facilities to which the agreement process would apply. Okay, so once the state agreement process happens, it would result in potentially a cost allocation method. And here's what the order says about the method that would come out of a state agreement process. So the state agreement method must identify who will pay for the specific facility selected under 1920 and how much they will pay. Voluntary contributions are okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about voluntary cost allocation in a little bit. But the method that is agreed to must be just, reasonable, and not unduly discriminatory or preferential, and must allocate costs in a manner that's roughly commensurate with estimated benefits. An important point here is this next bullet that from 1928 that states that states can request that the transmission provider run a reasonable number of additional analyses that could facilitate the design of a state agreement method. And I think that's something important as states think about a state agreement process, to recognize that these additional analyses may need to be developed during the planning period, because there's only 6 months after projects are selected that the state agreement method would be filed. So I think it's important for states to really think about how these additional analyses would be requested and the process for getting those in a timely way to support developing cost allocation. And then, as I said before, if approved by FERC, the state agreement method would override the ex ante method. So Deborah asked me to develop a potential elements of a template. So if states wanted to have a template to look at for a state agreement process, I pulled together some elements of a template here. Could start with just simple purpose and scope, and then address governance and membership. Identify whether it's just the RSCs that would participate or other folks. The decision-making process and specifically the voting requirements would be an important element of the state agreement process, as well as dispute resolution steps. One of the things that's come up as I've discussed this with folks is that it could be useful for the state agreement process to apply to a subgroup of states in a region. And so that's something that would also need to be laid out in the decision-making process. So, what if there is a subgroup of states that want to move forward with different cost allocation for a project? How would that impact voting? Something to consider there. And then participation for, maybe non-voting members to observe.
Juliet, you just hit mute by accident.
Sorry, Juliet, we've lost your.
Okay, am I back now?
You are back.
Okay. Okay, so let's see. I will just, hopefully I wasn't on mute too long.
I think we basically lost you for the beginning of this slide.
Okay. Yeah, so let's see. Just section 3 might look at negotiation timeline and process. How it would be initiated, as I described earlier. What would the process be for information request? The frequency of meetings and how would they be noticed? How confidential information would be handled. And then section 4 could be something like proposing and considering cost allocation methods, how they would be proposed by different entities, and the different methodologies that might be used to assess different methods, including benefits quantification processes, different cost allocation formulas, and voluntary funding. And finalizing and filing the agreement could be part of the process, as well as amendments and termination. So just some things to consider here in terms of what a state agreement process could look like. And then, two other considerations that I wanted to point out. One of the questions that I've heard is, how will FERC Order 1920 cost allocation and planning processes address entities that are not under FERC jurisdiction? Organizations like Tennessee Valley Authority, Bonneville Power Administration, and any municipal power systems or rural electric cooperatives that are not part of FERC Order 1920. And I think this is an open conversation in some areas. But just important to note that 1928 does talk about voluntary participation in the process, and it mentions that non-jurisdictional entities can voluntarily choose to enroll in a regional transmission planning processes and that by enrolling following these entities agree to abide by the cost allocation method for regional long-term transmission projects, but that there would be not be involuntarily assigned costs. So still a lot of questions on this, but just want to flag kind of what the Order 1920A states about this. And then my last main slide here is about this issue of the voluntary projects versus the state agreement process projects. And, you know, there are, it's kind of, there's not necessarily clear agreement on this, but I thought it'd be interesting to map out what does FERC Order 1920 say about voluntary funding versus state agreement process. And I think the biggest thing is that the voluntary funding it calls out that it can be something that can be agreed upon by both state entities as well as interconnection customers to pay for a portion or all of the costs of a project. And there's some other details on here. So if you're interested in this, you could take a look at this. But because FERC Order 1920 does talk about the voluntary and state agreement, and there's some subtle differences, but as I said, I think the biggest thing is that it's the interconnection customers are also included in the voluntary. With that, my last slide here is a plug for the technical assistance that is being offered by the U.S. Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office. And I know we've got Will Groshek and Logan Hughes on the call today, and they're leading this work, but we've got a number of different labs here that are providing technical assistance on FERC Order 1920, and actually a variety of other topics for states, and even we've now kicked off a technical assistance for utilities and transmission planners. But it's very easy to apply. There's a link here and a QR code, and the applications can be made at any time, and we have a variety of entities that are available to provide technical assistance. So that's all that I have. Happy to, yeah. Is there any questions? Or?
And I assume,